The mist didn't just hang over Seattle that morning. It seemed determined to erase it. I stood in the kitchen of my Queen Anne home, watching the gray fog swallow the Space Needle like a slow, deliberate ghost. It was 6:00 a.m., the hour I had spent the last 40 years cherishing. It was usually my time to catalog the silence, to enjoy the stillness before the world woke up. But today, the silence felt heavy. It pressed against my ribs, a physical weight that made it hard to take a full breath. The coffee in my mug had gone cold hours ago, a bitter sludge that matched the metallic taste of anxiety in my mouth. I hadn't taken a sip. I was just holding the ceramic for warmth, though the heat had long since leached away into the damp air. In the corner, the old radiator hissed, a rhythmic, lonely sound. Clank hiss, clank hiss. That radiator and I were the only two things left in this house that remembered when it was full of noise. I had spent 4 decades in the hushed whispers of the library, organizing other people's stories, making sure every book had its place on the shelf. I never realized how terrifying it was when your own story simply stopped. The phone sat on the granite countertop, glowing with a persistent, mocking light. I had been staring at the name on the screen for 3 full minutes before I found the strength to move my hand. Lucas. My fingers were trembling as I reached out. I hated myself for it. Why should a mother tremble when her only son calls? Why should the vibration of a phone feel like a threat? "Hello, Lucas," I said. My voice sounded thin, like old parchment that might tear if I spoke too loudly. "Hi, Mom." His voice was clear, but it wasn't alone. Behind him, I heard a world I had never been invited to visit. There was the soft, expensive clinking of silverware against china, the low, rich hum of a jazz trio playing somewhere in the distance, and the murmur of polite, wealthy laughter. It sounded like gold. "Look, I'm calling because I wanted to tell you personally, before you saw it on Instagram or whatever." He paused, and I heard him take a sip of something. "We did it. We got married yesterday at the estate by Lake Washington." The air left my lungs in a sharp, quiet huff. Yesterday. The word felt like a physical blow to the stomach, a sucker punch that doubled me over against the counter. I looked at the small calendar on my wall where I had circled his potential wedding date for months, a date he had told me was still being decided. I had bought a dress, a simple navy silk I thought wouldn't embarrass him. It was still hanging in my closet upstairs, shrouded in plastic, a shroud for a ghost that would never walk. You got married," I whispered, "without me." "Yesterday," Lucas cleared his throat. I could hear the hesitation, the calculated coldness he had learned from Harper and the Sterlings. "We decided to keep it intimate, Mom. The Sterlings, well, they had a very specific vision for the event." "A vision?" "They wanted a certain atmosphere," Lucas said, his voice gaining a defensive edge. "High-end, cohesive. You know how Victoria Sterling is about the flow of things. They felt that having too many guests from different backgrounds would disrupt the aesthetic. Harper's parents were just more worthy of being in that circle for the ceremony. They understand the nuances of these things." Worthy. The word echoed in my mind, bouncing off the peeling paint of my kitchen walls. I thought of the 30 years I spent working double shifts at the University of Washington Library, so Lucas could go to the best prep schools. I thought of the winters I wore the same threadbare coat so he could have the latest sneakers, the newest laptop, the life of a boy who never knew the taste of poverty. I thought of the night his father died of a heart attack in this very kitchen, and how I held Lucas for 12 hours straight, promising him that I would be his anchor. I had been worthy enough to pay for his life. I had been worthy enough to scrub his floors and fund his dreams. But I wasn't worthy enough to watch him start a new chapter. "I see," I said. I didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a cold, numbing sensation that started in my marrow. "You didn't think I would fit the aesthetic." "It's not like that, Mom," he snapped, the guilt making him angry. "Don't make this a drama. It was a logistical decision. We're going to have a small brunch for the extended relatives later this summer. You'll be invited to that. It'll be more your speed, less pressure." A small brunch, the leftovers of his affection. I looked at my hands, the skin spotted with age, the nails short and practical. These were the hands that had turned the pages of 1,000 bedtime stories, that had meticulously saved every penny into a trust fund he had drained the moment he turned 25. "Is Harper happy?" I asked. I didn't know why I cared. Maybe it was just the librarian in me wanting to make sure the ending of the book was at least orderly. "She's glowing," Lucas said, and for a second I heard the genuine adoration in his voice, the kind he used to reserve for me when he was 10 years old. "But look, Mom, there's another reason I'm calling." The tone shifted. The jazz music in the background seemed to swell, mocking me. "The wedding was spectacular, really, but there was a bit of a snag with the financing," he said, rushing the words. "The Sterlings, they had some issues with their liquid assets at the last minute. Some offshore accounts were frozen for a routine audit. It's nothing serious, just a timing thing." I closed my eyes. I knew what was coming. It was a script I had read too many times. "The venue and the catering need to be settled by noon today," he continued. "The total is $65,000. I told Harper not to worry, that my mom always has my back. It's just a loan. Obviously, once the Sterlings clear their audit, they'll pay you back with interest. I just sent the invoice to your email." He paused, waiting for the familiar yes. "You can do a wire transfer from your retirement account, right? It's urgent, Mom. The venue manager is being a real jerk about it." $65,000. The number hung in the air between us, heavier than the Seattle fog. It was almost exactly what I had left in my supplemental retirement fund. It was my safety net. It was the money I had set aside so I wouldn't have to ask him for help when my knees finally gave out or when the roof of this old house started to leak. He was asking for my survival to pay for a party I wasn't good enough to attend. I stood there, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the expensive laughter on the other end of the line, while the silence of my empty house screamed around me. The invoice hit my inbox with a cheerful asterisk ping asterisk, a digital demand for a sacrifice I wasn't sure I could survive making. I pulled my laptop toward me, the metal casing cold against my fingertips. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the dim kitchen with a harsh, artificial blue glow. And there it was. The email from Alessandro at Lux Events. The attachment didn't look like a bill. It looked like an invitation to a ball I wasn't allowed to enter. The logo was embossed in a digital gold leaf, an elegant, swirling script that sat atop the page like a crown. Below it, the breakdown was written in a clean, minimalist sans serif font, the kind of font that made debt look sophisticated. I adjusted my glasses, my eyes blurring as I tried to comprehend the line items. Custom floral installations, white peonies imported, $10,000. 5-course plated dinner, Wagyu beef option, $15,000. Premium open bar, top shelf reserve, $12,000. $12,000 for alcohol, for champagne that would be sipped by people who didn't know my name, for wine that would be flushed out of their systems by morning. I read the numbers again, hoping they were a mistake, a cruel typo. But the total at the bottom remained stubborn and unyielding, $65,000. It was almost exactly the balance of my supplemental retirement fund. It was the money for my hip surgery if I ever needed it. It was the money for a new heater when the radiator finally died. It was my independence, formatted into a PDF. "Mom, you still there?" Lucas asked, his voice tinny through the phone speaker. "I sent it, did you get it?" His voice dissolved into the hum of the radiator, and suddenly, I wasn't in my kitchen anymore. The year slipped backward, sliding through the decades like a film reel catching on a jagged tooth. It was 20 years ago, a Tuesday. The rain was hammering against the windows of this very house, but it was colder then, or maybe I was just more tired. Lucas was 12. He was a lanky, awkward boy with knees that knocked together and eyes that still looked at me as if I hung the moon. He had come home from school clutching a crumpled flyer for the middle school winter gala. He didn't want the hand-me-down blazer from the thrift store on 15th Avenue. He wanted a suit, a specific charcoal gray suit from the department store downtown. It cost $300. I remembered the weight of my bank balance that night. $14.12. I didn't tell him no. I never told him no. Instead, I took a second job. I spent my days in the hush of the library, shelving books until my shoulders knotted. And then, when the sun went down, I drove to a diner near the ship canal. The memory of that smell hit me so hard I nearly gagged. The thick, rancid scent of old fryer oil and cheap lemon detergent. It was a smell that clung to my hair, my skin, the fibers of my clothes. I couldn't wash it off. For a month, I worked the graveyard shift, scraping congealed grease off the grill, mopping floors that were sticky with spilled soda and mud. I remembered the physical sensation of that month. My feet felt like they were being crushed in a vice. My back screamed every time I bent down to bus a table. I slept for 3 hours a night, waking up before dawn to make Luca's breakfast, smiling through the exhaustion so he wouldn't see the dark circles under my eyes. I worked until my hands were red and chapped, until my spirit felt like it had been scrubbed raw. And when I finally walked into that department store and counted out the crumpled 20s and 10s, tips I had hoarded in a coffee tin, I felt like a queen. I remembered the way Lucas looked in that charcoal suit. He stood in the living room, adjusting his tie in the mirror, his chest puffed out with a newfound dignity. He turned to me, his eyes wet with a child's unfiltered gratitude, and whispered, "Mom, you're the best. One day I'm going to buy you a castle. I'm going to make sure you never have to work again." Where did that boy go? I looked at the laptop screen, at the *1200* charge for a premium open bar. That boy was a ghost now. He had been buried under layers of Harper Sterling's expensive silk and the hollow prestige of a family that couldn't pay their own bills. The Lucas who wanted to buy me a castle had been replaced by a man who saw my 30 years of labor not as a gift, but as a resource to be mined. He didn't want to protect me from work. He wanted me to work asterisk for asterisk him. He wanted to liquidate the sweat of my brow, to buy approval from people who would never let me through their front gate. "Mom," Lucas's voice was impatient now. "It's really simple. Just click the link. The venue manager is staring at me." I looked at the cursor hovering over the button that said *submit payment*. My finger trembled over the trackpad. If I clicked that button, I was safe in his love for another few months. I would be the good mother, the anchor, the silent financier of his happiness. But if I clicked that button, I would have $3,000 left to my name. I was staring at the price tag of my own erasure. "I see it, Lucas," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "I'm looking right at it." "Mom, please tell me you clicked send. The planner is literally standing over me, tapping his foot." Lucas's voice cracked through the phone, tight with a panic that wasn't about survival, but about embarrassment. I could hear the background noise of the airport intensify, the robotic drone of a TSA announcement, the squeak of luggage wheels, the rush of people going places where they were wanted. I sat in the wingback chair in the living room, the one that used to belong to his father. The leather was cold against my back. I took a sip of the coffee. It was revoltingly bitter, but I swallowed it anyway. It woke me up. "Lucas," I said. My voice was no longer the thin, tearing parchment of the morning. It had hardened. It sounded like the voice I used to use when a patron refused to return a reference book, polite, firm, and non-negotiable. I looked at the invoice. "Great, so it's done." "No," I said, "it isn't." The silence on the other end was absolute. It lasted for 3 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. "What do you mean no?" He laughed, a short, nervous sound. "Mom, the signal is bad, I thought you said." "I said no, Lucas. I'm not paying $65,000 for a wedding I was explicitly told I wasn't aesthetic enough to attend." Are you punishing me?" His voice dropped an octave, shifting from panic to a low, hissing fury. "Is that what this is? You're petty because you didn't get an invite to the ceremony? Mom, grow up. We went over this. It was an intimate gathering. It wasn't personal." "It felt personal when you asked for my life savings," I replied, my gaze fixed on the space needle piercing the gray sky outside. It looked sharp, unyielding. "And $65,000 is very personal, Lucas. That is my life. That is my grocery money. That is the roof over my head. Oh my God, stop being so dramatic, he shouted, and I heard people in the airport shush him. He lowered his voice, but the venom remained. You have the house. It's paid off. You have your pension. You're acting like I'm leaving you on the street. Harper is in the bathroom crying because she thinks her day is ruined. Victoria Sterling is asking questions. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is for me? To have to tell my new family that my mother is holding out on us. Your new family, I repeated. The words tasted like copper. The Sterlings, the worthy ones. Yes, they are people of status, Mom. They have a reputation. If this bill goes to collections, it destroys their credit. It destroys our asterisk start. You're sabotaging me. I closed my eyes. I saw the boy in the charcoal suit again, looking at me with adoration. And then I saw the man he had become, a man who would bleed me dry to keep up appearances with a family of strangers. Lucas, I said, and a strange calm settled over me. It was the calm of a librarian who realizes a book is beyond repair and must be discarded. I spent 40 years organizing the world into categories: fiction, nonfiction, biography, tragedy. And do you know what I've learned? I don't care about your books right now, Mom. I learned that you cannot buy character, I continued, overtalking him. And you certainly cannot buy worthiness with a catering bill. You and the Sterlings think you can edit people out of your lives like bad paragraphs. You edited me out, and now you want the editor to pay for the printing costs. Just pay the bill, he screamed. I swear I'll pay you back. I'll sign a note. Just do it. No. If you don't do this, he breathed, his voice trembling with a terrifying finality, if you let me get on this plane with this debt hanging over my head, don't bother waiting for the brunch invitation. Don't bother calling at Christmas. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. Are you threatening me, Lucas? I'm telling you the truth, he spat. You're being selfish. You're a bitter, selfish old woman who can't stand to see her son succeed. If you don't transfer that money in the next 5 minutes, you're dead to me. You're dead to me. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I felt the impact in my chest, a hollow thud that momentarily stopped my heart. It was the sound of a cord snapping, the thick, braided cord of motherhood that I had spent 30 years reinforcing, strand by strand, sacrifice by sacrifice. I waited for the tears. I waited for the collapse. I waited for the desperate urge to beg, to plead, to open my laptop and type in the bank codes just to hear him say he loved me one more time. But the urge didn't come. Instead, the pain washed over me and then receded, and in its wake it left a vast, cool space. It was the feeling of putting down a heavy load after walking for miles. It was the feeling of walking out of the diner after that final shift, knowing I never had to scrape grease again. He had fired me. He had relieved me of my duties. I was no longer the anchor. I was no longer the bank. I was just a leaner. No, Lucas, I said softly. No what? No, you won't pay. No, I haven't lost you, I said, a single tear finally breaking free, not from sadness, but from relief. I lost my son a long time ago. I just didn't realize he'd been replaced by a stranger until the stranger tried to rob me. Mom. Enjoy Maui, I said, my voice steady, cool, and perfectly articulated. I hope the champagne was worth it. I took the phone away from my ear. I didn't press the red button immediately. I held it there for a second, looking at the screen, at the little photo of him I had set as his contact icon, a picture from his college graduation. Then, with a thumb that didn't tremble, I ended the call. The silence that rushed back into the living room wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the morning. It didn't press against my ribs. It felt expansive. It felt like the silence of a library after the doors have been locked and the lights dimmed, a silence that belongs only to you. It was clean. I sat there for a long time, listening to the rain tap against the glass. I was alone. I was dead to my only child. And for the first time in years, I took a breath that filled my lungs completely. The silence in the kitchen wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting for instructions. I stood up from the wingback chair, my joints popping in the quiet room. I didn't feel the crushing weight of grief I expected. Instead, I felt a cold, clinical efficiency taking over, the same sensation I used to get when faced with a chaotic stack of unsorted returns at the library. The mess needed to be cleared. I walked to the wall calendar. The date of the wedding, *yesterday*, was circled in red marker, a hopeful, vibrant loop I had drawn months ago. I didn't just cross it out. I ripped the entire page off the spiral binding, the paper making a sharp *reap sound that felt satisfyingly violent. I crumpled the month of June into a tight ball and threw it into the trash bin. Then I went upstairs. The closet smelled of lavender sachets and mothballs. I pulled out the navy silk dress. I took off the plastic cover, the crinkle of the material sounding like dry leaves. The fabric was soft, expensive, a deep, bruised blue like the Puget Sound on a storm day. I had spent weeks finding the right shoes, the right pearl earrings. I had imagined the moment I would see Lucas stand at the altar. I had imagined the look of love in his eyes when he saw his mother in the front row. I didn't throw the dress on the floor. I folded it, neatly, methodically. I placed it into a cardboard box marked for the Salvation Army. I taped the box shut. "Someone else can wear you," I whispered to the cardboard. "Someone who is actually invited to the party." The phone rang again. I knew it wouldn't be Lucas. He had said his piece. I looked at the caller ID, a Bellevue number, Lux Events. I picked it up. "Mrs. Vance." The voice was male, smooth, and coated in a veneer of professional panic. "This is Alessandro from Lux Events. We're still waiting on the final authorization for the Sterling Vance invoice. Lucas mentioned you were handling the transfer, but the system is showing pending." I walked to the window, looking out at the gray street. A neighbor was walking a golden retriever. Life was going on. "Alessandro," I said, my voice steady, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding. Mrs. Vance, the vendors are threatening to pack up. The balance is $65,000. "Yes, I saw the invoice. It's very detailed." I paused. "But here is the thing, Alessandro. I was not a guest at that wedding." Excuse me." "I wasn't invited," I continued, my tone as cool as the rain on the glass. "I wasn't part of the aesthetic. And in my experience, people who aren't invited to the party usually don't pay for the champagne." "But," Lucas said. "Lucas is a married man now." I cut him off. "I suggest you talk to his new, worthy family about the bill. I'm sure people of such high status can cover a bar tab." I hung up. I didn't wait for his stuttered reply. I needed to get out of the house. The walls were starting to feel like they were watching me. I grabbed my raincoat and keys and drove. I didn't drive to the ocean or the mountains. I drove to the one place where I had always made sense, the University of Washington. The Sazalo Library rose up like a Gothic cathedral, its stone spires piercing the low clouds. I walked up the grand staircase, my heels clicking on the stone, and entered the reading room. The smell hit me instantly, that intoxicating blend of old glue, dust, curring leather, and vanilla. It was the scent of 1,000,000 lives bound in paper. The ceiling soared 65 feet above me, vaulted with oak and painted with symbols of inspiration. Light filtered through the stained glass, casting long, colored shadows across the rows of long oak tables. I sat in a corner, running my hand over the varnished wood of the table. For 40 years, I had worked in this system. I had cataloged the thoughts of geniuses and fools. I had organized tragedies and comedies. And as I sat there, surrounded by the silence of the stacks, I realized something profound. I had spent my entire life believing I was a character in a story about love and sacrifice. I thought I was the protagonist of a quiet, noble drama about a widow raising a son against the odds. But I wasn't. To Lucas and to the Sterlings, I wasn't the protagonist. I wasn't even the antagonist. I was a prop. I was a supporting character, an NPC, a non-playable character existing in the background to provide gold coins and emotional labor so the real heroes could go on their quest. I opened a book of poetry someone had left on the table, the Odyssey. I read a line about the sea, about how it doesn't apologize for its tide. I closed the book with a snap. I wasn't a logistical decision. I wasn't a bank account with a heartbeat. I was a leaner Vance. I was a librarian. I knew where the information was hidden, and supporting characters don't get to audit the villains, but protagonists do. I felt a shift in my chest. The grief was still there, a dull ache, but it was being overtaken by something hotter, sharper. I checked my phone. I had turned it off, but now I powered it back on. There was a voicemail, not from Lucas. "Eleanor, darling." The voice was sticky sweet, breathless and condescending. "Victoria Sterling." "This is Victoria. Lucas told me you were having a bit of a moment regarding the finances. We are all just so embarrassed by this technical glitch with our offshore accounts. It's dreadful, really. But look, Arthur and I were thinking. It seems you might be overwhelmed by the complexity of your assets. We'd hate for you to make a mistake in your confusion." I held the phone away from my ear, staring at it in disbelief. "Arthur has some wonderful people in wealth management. We're going to help you, Eleanor. We need to make sure your funds are liquid. We'll be in the city tomorrow. We'll stop by at 2:00 to help you sort this out. We can't have Lucas worrying about his mother's stability on his honeymoon, can we? See you then." Click. I stood on the steps of the library, the wind whipping my hair across my face. They weren't just asking for money anymore. They were coming to manage me. They were coming to see if the old widow was senile enough to sign over the deed to her house or empty her pension under the guise of assistance. They thought I was a confused old woman. They thought I was a resource to be harvested. I looked back at the library, at the fortress of knowledge behind me. Then I looked toward the parking lot. I wasn't going to hide. If Victoria Sterling wanted to see my assets, I would show them to her. But first, I needed to see exactly what kind of wealth the Sterlings were hiding behind their offshore excuses. I got in my car. I wasn't going home. I was going to the scene of the crime. The drive from the university to Lake Washington was a blur of gray asphalt and rhythmic wiper blades. Click swish, a metronome for my rising suspicion. Victoria Sterling's voice kept looping in my head, sticky and sweet. Technical glitch, offshore accounts, routine audit. I gripped the steering wheel of my 10-year-old Volvo until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't a forensic accountant, but I had spent 40 years reading the Wall Street Journal in the break room. I knew that routine audits didn't freeze liquid assets for billionaires unless something was catastrophically wrong. Wealthy people didn't get their accounts locked. They had lawyers who prevented that before the first letter from the IRS was even printed. Frozen assets happened to the careless. They happened to the crumbling. I needed to see the place. I needed to see the aesthetic that was worth $65,000 of my blood and bone. I turned off the main road and wound my way down toward the water, into the zip codes where the driveways had names and the fences were higher than the houses. The estate appeared on the left, a sprawling monument to glass and cedar tucked behind high, ivy-covered walls. I parked my dented gray sedan across the street, a smudge of reality in a pristine world. The iron gates were closed, but I could see through the bars. The party was over. The worthy guests had gone home to their warm beds, but the remnants of the fantasy were still scattered across the lawn like the bones of a feast left for the vultures. I got out of the car. The rain had picked up, a cold, needle-like drizzle that soaked through my coat instantly. I crossed the street and stood at the gate. It was a scene of abandoned luxury. There were white rose petals scattered across the sodden grass, thousands of them, turning brown and translucent in the mud. They looked like bruised skin. Under a dripping white canopy, a stack of rented Chayavari chairs, painted gold, of course, sat unevenly, looking cheap and garish in the harsh light of day. A crew of workers was dismantling the floral arch near the water. They looked tired, moving with the sluggishness of people who hadn't been tipped yet. I scanned the ground near the gate, and then I saw it. Lying in a puddle near the stone pillar was a booklet. It had been dropped, perhaps by a guest fumbling for their keys or checking their phone for an Uber. I reached through the wrought iron bars, straining my shoulder until my fingers brushed the wet paper. I pinched the corner and pulled it through. It was heavy cardstock, cream-colored with gold leaf edges. The water had warped it, but the embossed text was still legible. The union of Harper Sterling and Lucas Vance. I wiped a smear of mud off the cover and opened it. The interior was a layout of perfect typography. It listed the order of the ceremony, the reading of the vows, the musical selections, a string quartet naturally, and then the acknowledgments. My eyes scanned the bottom of the page. Parents of the bride, asterisk, Mr. Charles and Mrs. Victoria Sterling. I looked for the next line. I looked for asterisk mother of the groom asterisk. I looked for asterisk Mrs. Eleanor Vance asterisk. I looked for the late Robert Vance asterisk. There was nothing. There was simply a line that read, "The groom's party." I stood there, the rain dripping from the end of my nose, staring at the empty white space where my name should have been. I wasn't just uninvited, I had been erased. To the guests who sat in those gold chairs yesterday, Lucas Vance had sprung fully formed from the earth, or perhaps from the Sterling's own benevolence. There was no history of a mother who worked 2 jobs. There was no father who died of a heart attack in a kitchen in Queen Anne. There was only the Sterling aesthetic, a narrative so fragile that the mere mention of a librarian mother would have shattered it. A cold, deep fury settled into my stomach. It wasn't the hot, tearful rage of the morning. This was different. This was a asterisk librarian's fury. It is the specific, icy anger you feel when you realize a precious volume has been intentionally defaced. It is the rage of seeing a page torn out of a history book because the truth was inconvenient to the reader. They hadn't just rejected me, they had falsified the record. They had tried to edit the archive of my son's life to suit their vanity. I looked up at the house, at the towering windows that Lucas had boasted about on the phone. It looked impressive from a distance. But now, standing closer, I saw things I hadn't noticed before. The ivy on the wall was overgrown, choking the brickwork rather than adorning it. The gold paint on the gate was chipping near the hinges, revealing rusted iron underneath. And looking at the windows of the estate, I noticed that half of them were dark, no curtains, just empty black squares. Why are the liquid assets frozen, Victoria? I looked back down at the soggy program. I folded it carefully, not out of respect, but out of the need to preserve evidence. I put it in my pocket. My grief was gone. Grief is a passive emotion, it washes over you. But what I felt now was active. It was a research project. I walked back to my car, my heels crunching on the wet pavement. I didn't look back at the roses or the lake. I had seen enough. If the Sterlings wanted to erase me, they had made a grave miscalculation. You never try to hide the truth from a woman whose entire life has been built on finding things. I started the engine. The Volvo rumbled to life, a sturdy, reliable sound. I wasn't going to cry anymore. I was going to conduct an audit of my own. And unlike the one in the Cayman Islands, this one wasn't going to be a glitch. It was going to be a reckoning. The house was dark when I returned, save for the amber glow of the street lamp filtering through the sheer curtains. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I didn't want the warmth. I wanted the cold, sharp focus of the shadows. I hung my wet coat on the rack, the heavy wool smelling of rain and exhaust. My hands were still cold from the metal gate at the estate, but my mind was burning with a feverish, rhythmic intensity. I walked straight past the living room, past the empty chair where I had wept only hours ago, and into the small study tucked behind the kitchen. This was my domain. It was a small room, lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves that I had built myself. The desk was old oak, scarred by years of use, covered in stacks of papers and a sturdy, reliable laptop. For 40 years, I had come to this desk to pay bills, to write Christmas cards, and to read. But tonight, it wasn't a desk. It was an operating table, and I was about to dissect the Sterling family name until I found the rot. I went to the kitchen first and brewed a fresh pot of tea. Earl Grey, strong. I needed the caffeine to sharpen the edges of my thoughts. I brought the steaming mug back to the study, sat down, and opened my laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a ghostly blue pallor over my face. I adjusted my reading glasses and cracked my knuckles. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a researcher. I was the woman who could find a misfiled census record from 1920 in a basement full of dust. I knew that the truth wasn't what people told you. The truth was what they wrote down when they thought no one was looking. I started with the basics. Charles Sterling, Seattle, real estate. The search results were exactly what I expected. Fluff. A few press releases from 5 years ago about a visionary development in Bellevue that never broke ground. A photo of Victoria Sterling at a charity gala, holding a glass of champagne, looking thin and expensive. A LinkedIn profile for Harper that listed her occupation simply as consultant, a vague title that usually meant unemployed with a trust fund. It was the aesthetic. It was the digital version of the gold leaf program, shiny, curated, and shallow. But I knew how to look deeper. I knew that the real story wasn't on Google's first page. It was in the county clerk's archives. It was in the tax assessment databases. It was in the litigation logs. I navigated to the King County Public Records portal. My fingers flew across the keys, the clack, clack, clack sounding like gunfire in the quiet house. I typed in Sterling Charles. The screen loaded, the little wheel spinning, and then the list populated. It wasn't a list of assets. It was a list of liabilities. My eyes widened as I scrolled. There were liens, so many liens. 2021, federal tax lien, Internal Revenue Service, amount $482,000. 2022, judgment, vendor, Pacific Northwest Construction, amount $115,000. 2023, foreclosure notice, property, 442 Evergreen Point Road. I clicked on the foreclosure notice. The address looked familiar. I pulled the soggy wedding program out of my pocket and cross-referenced it. It wasn't the estate where the wedding was held. It was their previous home. They had lost it. They had been kicked out of their own ancestral home a year ago. "So where are you living now?" I whispered to the screen. I looked up the address of the Lake Washington estate, the one with the ivy and the rented chairs. I ran a title search. Owner of record, Vantage Holdings LLC. It wasn't them. They didn't own the wedding venue. They didn't own the family estate. I dug deeper into Vantage Holdings. It was a shell company based in Delaware, currently involved in a lawsuit against a tenant for failure to vacate and unauthorized use of property. The pieces clicked together with a sickening snap. The Sterlings weren't wealthy. They were squatters. They were living in a corporate asset that was tangled in legal limbo, playing house in a mansion they had likely rented and then stopped paying for. The offshore audit Lucas had mentioned, it wasn't an audit. It was a freeze order. They were drowning. I took a sip of tea. It had gone cold, but I didn't notice. I was staring into the abyss of my son's new life. I kept digging. I wanted to know about the wedding. If they were this broke, how had they managed to hire Lux Events? How had they managed to book the florist? I searched for Victoria Sterling in the civil court records. And there it was, the smoking gun. A lawsuit filed 6 months ago in Oregon. Plaintiff, Ethereal Catering Co. versus defendant, Victoria Sterling. Complaint, non-payment for services rendered. Breach of contract. Amount, $22,000. I read the court filings. The pattern was identical. Victoria had hired them for a luxury engagement brunch, promised a wire transfer from an investment account, and then ghosted them the moment the quiche was eaten. They were grifters. They were a family of vampires who moved from town to town, finding vendors to stiff and landlords to deceive. They built their lives on credit and charisma, leaving a trail of unpaid bills and ruined small businesses in their wake. And then they found Lucas. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking. I took off my glasses and rubbed the bridge of my nose. The realization made me nauseous. Lucas wasn't just a son-in-law to them. He was fresh meat. They had seen him, young, ambitious, with a high-paying tech job and a trust fund he had just accessed. They had seen his hunger to belong to a class he didn't understand. They smelled his desperation like sharks smell blood in the water. They didn't love him. They needed him. They needed his credit score to sign a lease they couldn't qualify for. They needed his income to pay off the most aggressive creditors. And now, they needed his mother's retirement fund to pay for the wedding that was supposed to cement their status. The $65,000 wasn't for a snag. It wasn't a loan that would be paid back with interest. It was a donation to a black hole. If I sent that money, it would vanish instantly, swallowed by the caterer, the florist, or maybe just pocketed by Charles Sterling to pay off the IRS lien so he wouldn't go to jail. "Oh, Lucas," I whispered into the dark room. "You stupid, stupid boy." He thought he had married a princess. He thought he was entering a world of high-end aesthetics. But he had married into a burning building, and he was the only one bringing a bucket of water. I looked at the invoice again, the one still open in my email. $65,000. The audacity of it took my breath away. They knew I was a widow. They knew I was a librarian. They probably knew exactly how much my house was worth because they had likely looked it up on Zillow the moment Lucas mentioned my name. They weren't just asking for help. They were harvesting us. My eyes drifted to the email from Charles Sterling that had arrived an hour ago, the one suggesting a meeting to manage my funds. "We'd hate for you to make a mistake in your confusion," Victoria had said. I felt a cold smile touch my lips. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just found the one book that could topple an entire shelf. They thought I was confused. They thought I was a legacy problem to be handled. I looked at the stack of printed documents growing on my desk. Tax liens, foreclosure notices, civil lawsuits, bankruptcy filings. I wasn't confused. I was the most informed person in the entire equation. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It was late, past 9:00 p.m., but I knew he would be awake. He was always awake. "Tobias," I said when the line clicked open. "Alina," his voice was raspy, surprised. "Is everything all right? It's late." "No, Tobias. Everything is very wrong," I said, my eyes fixed on the screen where Charles Sterling's tax evasion record glowed in high definition. "But I have a project, a research project, and I need a second pair of eyes." "What kind of project?" "I have a story that needs organizing," I said, channeling the calm authority of the head librarian. "It's a tragedy about worthiness and debt, and I think it's time we audited the Sterling household." I hung up the phone. The rain hammered against the roof, a drumroll for the war that was about to begin. I wasn't going to sleep tonight. I had 40 years of archival skills, and I was going to build a dossier so heavy it would crush their aesthetic into dust. They wanted to manage my assets. Fine. I printed the foreclosure notice. The printer whirred and spat out the paper. I was ready to show them exactly what I was worth. The sun rose over Seattle with a deceptive brilliance, piercing the gray clouds to illuminate the dust motes dancing in my living room. It was 8:00 a.m. I hadn't slept. I sat at my kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a fresh mug of tea, staring at the screen of my phone. The email from Charles Sterling asterisk sat in my inbox like a coiled viper. I had read it a dozen times since dawn, dissecting every word with the precision of a surgeon. "Alina, regarding the transfer issues, Victoria, and I feel it's best if we step in to assist. We've scheduled a consultation with our private wealth team, but we'd love to sit down with you personally first to go over your portfolio. We'll come by at 2:00 p.m. We want to ensure your retirement assets are structured for maximum liquidity. It's what Lucas would want." Maximum liquidity. In the library of financial euphemisms, that phrase was filed under robbery. They didn't just want the $65,000. That was just the appetizer. They were coming for the main course. I looked up from the screen and let my gaze drift through the archway into the living room. I looked at the heavy oak floorboards I had polished on my hands and knees every Sunday for 30 years. I looked at the built-in bookshelves flanking the fireplace, filled with volumes I had collected since I was 22. I looked at the crown molding, the sturdy craftsman beams that held up the roof. They saw this house as an asset. They saw a Zillow estimate. They saw a vintage charm that could be leveraged, mortgaged, or sold to cover a bridge loan for a property they couldn't afford. But to me, this house wasn't real estate. It was a fortress. It was the physical manifestation of 40 years of saying no to frivolity so I could say yes to security. It was built on double shifts at the diner. It was insulated with the quiet, steady warmth of a life lived within its means. It was where I had nursed my husband when his heart began to fail. It was where I had measured Lucas's height against the doorframe, marking his growth in pencil lines that were still there, faint and gray under the varnish. The Sterlings were coming to breach the walls. They were coming to convince a confused widow that the best way to help her son was to hand over the keys to the castle. A cold, steely resolve hardened in my chest. I stood up and walked to the window. "You are not walking out of here with my home," I whispered to the glass. "You are not taking the only thing I have left." But I knew I couldn't do this alone. I was a librarian, I dealt in information. But the Sterlings were grifters, they dealt in manipulation. They would come with fast talk, confusing jargon, and the emotional leverage of my son. I needed a shield. I needed a witness who spoke their language better than they did. I picked up the landline. The receiver felt heavy, substantial, a weapon from a different era. I dialed the number I had called briefly last night, but this time I wasn't calling to vent. I was calling to strategize. "Tobias," I said when he picked up on the second ring. "I'm already up, Alina," his voice rasped, dry and sharp as old parchment. "I've been looking at the files you sent over. The construction lien in Bellevue. It's a work of art. I haven't seen a shell game that sloppy since the 90s. "They're coming here, Tobias," I said, cutting straight to the point. "At 2:00 p.m. today, Charles and Victoria. They say they want to help me structure my assets for liquidity." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low, dark chuckle. "Liquidity," Tobias muttered. "They want to drain you, Alina. They're going to try to get power of attorney or at least get you to sign a co-signer agreement for a loan. They're desperate, and desperate people are dangerous." "I know," I said. "That's why I need you." "I'm retired, Alina. My license is dusty." "Your license is fine, and I don't need a lawyer, I need a truth-teller." I took a deep breath, looking at the empty chair at the head of my dining table. "I need you to come over. Bring your briefcase. Bring the one with the hard latch." "The intimidation briefcase." "The one that looks like it contains indictments," I clarified. "I'll be there at 1:30, Tobias said, the tone of his voice shifting from friend to professional. "Put on a pot of coffee, and a leaner." "Yes." "Don't clean the house too much. Let it look lived in. Let it look like a place that has stood for 100 years and will stand for 100 more. Don't let them think they're walking into a staging area. Let them see the fortress." "I understand," I said. "And one more thing," he added. "Do you still have that dress, the navy one?" "The one I was supposed to wear to the wedding." "Wear it," Tobias said firmly. "Don't greet them in an apron. Don't greet them in a cardigan. Greet them in the silk. Show them you were ready for the party they didn't invite you to. Show them exactly who they insulted." "I will," I said. I hung up the phone. The fear that had been gnawing at my stomach since yesterday was gone. In its place was a buzzing, electric energy. It was the feeling of preparing for a storm you knew you could survive. I walked into the dining room. This would be the battlefield. I cleared the table of the centerpiece, a simple bowl of fruit. I wiped the wood down until it gleamed. I went to the sideboard and pulled out the good china, the teacups with the gold rims that had belonged to my grandmother. I set 4 places. One for me, one for Tobias, one for Victoria, one for Charles. I placed the cups with military precision. I wanted them to see the order. I wanted them to see that this was a house where details mattered, where nothing was out of place, and where errors were caught and corrected. I went to the window and watched the street. The neighborhood was quiet, the ordinary rhythm of a Tuesday morning unfolding. But inside 422 Queen Anne Drive, the trap was set. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the curator of their downfall. And at 2:00 p.m. the exhibition would open. At 1:30 p.m., a sound broke the quiet anticipation of the afternoon, the distinct, dry rattle of a muffler that had seen too many winters. I looked out the window to see Tobias Finch's car pulling into my driveway. It was a 1998 sedan, a faded, oxidized blue that looked less like a vehicle and more like a bruised plum. It sat starkly against the pristine gray concrete, an unapologetic relic of a time when things were built to last, even if they got ugly in the process. Tobias stepped out, clutching the handle of a leather briefcase that was scuffed at the corners. He was 75, a man composed entirely of sharp angles and tweed. He wore a jacket that had been out of fashion since the Carter administration, patched at the elbows, and his wire-rimmed glasses were perched precariously on a nose that always seemed to be sniffing out an inconsistency. I opened the door before he could knock. "Eleanor," he said, nodding once. His voice was like the rustling of dry leaves, brittle but clear. "You look like a woman who's been shelving the apocalypse." "Come in, Tobias," I said, stepping aside. He wiped his feet on the mat with excessive thoroughness, a habit from the 30 years he spent visiting my library every Tuesday at 2:00 p.m. to read the financial journals. We had never been dinner friends. We were quiet friends. We were two people who found comfort in the Dewey Decimal System, in the belief that if you just organized the world correctly, it would stop being so chaotic. We sat at the dining room table. I had already laid out the files, the tax liens, the foreclosure notice, the lawsuit from the caterer. Tobias didn't ask for tea. He simply set his briefcase on the table, snapped the brass latches open with a loud asterisk click-click asterisk, and pulled out a magnifying glass. He didn't look at me. He looked at the paper. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional asterisk hum from Tobias as he traced a line of numbers with a manicured fingernail. Finally, he took off his glasses and looked at me. His eyes, usually pale and watery, were hard. "You were right," he said, "but you weren't right enough." "How bad is it?" I asked, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "It's not just insolvency, Eleanor. It's a Ponzi scheme with a family crest." He tapped the document regarding asterisk Vantage Holdings ***. "This offshore audit Lucas mentioned, that's not an audit. That's a Chapter 15 bankruptcy freeze initiated by creditors in the Cayman Islands. They aren't trying to count the money. They're trying to find where Charles hid it before the feds get there." He picked up the catering lawsuit. "And this is the pattern. They pay the deposit to look legitimate, host the event to take the photos, and then stiff the vendor on the balance. They finance the asterisk appearance of wealth by stealing the labor of working people." He looked at me grimly. "They are financing their life with other people's hope." "And now they want my retirement," I said, my voice flat. "They don't want it, Eleanor. They need it. They are cannibalizing everything around them to keep the lights on for one more month." Tobias leaned forward. "If you sign anything today, a loan, a cosign, even a management agreement, you will lose this house. They will leverage it by Tuesday, and by Friday the bank will own it." I looked at the papers. I thought of Lucas. "Does he know?" I asked. "Does Lucas know they are frauds?" Tobias hesitated. He was a man of facts, but he knew this answer required nuance. "He knows enough," Tobias said softly. "He knows they have cash flow problems. He knows they have legal complications. But he's choosing not to know the rest." "He's a victim," I whispered. "No, Eleanor," Tobias said, his voice sharp. "He's an accomplice." I flinched, but Tobias didn't pull back. "He's smart, Eleanor. You raised him to be smart. If he wanted to see the truth, he would have looked. He wants the lie. He wants to be a Sterling more than he wants to be a Vance. He's willing to let them rob you because if he stops them, he has to admit that he married a mirage." The truth settled over me like a heavy blanket. My son wasn't being tricked. He was trading me. He was trading my security for his admission ticket to the VIP section. "So," I said, straightening my spine, "we aren't just saving my money, we're breaking the spell." "Exactly." Tobias began to organize the papers into a neat stack, placing the most damning tax lien on top. We aren't going to give them a check. We are going to give them a mirror. He closed his briefcase and looked at the box by the front door, the one marked for donation. Is that the dress? He asked, pointing. Yes, I said. I was going to donate it. Take it out, Tobias commanded. Tobias, it's a party dress. I'm not going to a party. I'm going to a demolition. That's why you need to wear it, he said, standing up. If you wear your cardigan and your house slippers, they'll see a mother. They'll see a retiree they can bully. They'll see the woman who wiped Lucas's nose. He walked over to the box and tapped it with his shoe. But if you wear that silk, if you wear the pearls, then they see a peer. They see a woman of status. They see someone who knows her own worth. He smiled, a rare, dry expression. Don't dress for the job you have, Aliner. Dress for the job you're about to do, and today you are the executioner. I looked at the box, then I looked at Tobias. You're right, I said. I picked up the box and walked toward the stairs. Give me 10 minutes, I said, and Tobias. Yes. When they get here, don't say a word until I tell you to. I'm just the auditor, Aliner, he said, sitting back down and crossing his arms. I'm just here to count the bodies. I'll be in the study, Tobias said, closing the briefcase with a final, decisive snap. When they arrive, I want them to see you, and only you. They need to think the fortress is unguarded before we drop the portcullis. He picked up his papers and retreated into the small room off the kitchen, leaving the door slightly ajar, a sliver of shadow in the bright hallway. I was alone again, but this time the solitude didn't feel hollow. It felt potent. I walked up the stairs, my hand gliding along the banister. The wood was cool and smooth, polished by the friction of 1,000 mornings. I entered my bedroom and closed the door. The box from the Salvation Army sat on the bed. I cut the tape with a pair of scissors, the sound sharp and violent in the quiet room. I pulled out the navy silk dress. It cascaded out of the cardboard, shimmering like a pool of dark water. I took off my house clothes, the sensible gray slacks, the beige cardigan, the uniform of the invisible widow. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my slip, looking at my reflection. I saw the softness of my stomach, the map of veins on my legs, the slackness of my neck. For months, I had looked at this body and seen only expiration. I had seen a vessel that had served its purpose and was now waiting to be discarded. But today I saw something else. I saw history. I saw endurance. I stepped into the dress. The silk was cool against my skin, heavy and substantial. I zipped it up. It fit perfectly. When I had bought it, I had worried it was too tight, too bold. I had worried it would make me look like I was trying too hard to fit into the Sterling's high-end world. I smoothed the fabric over my hips. I wasn't trying to fit into their world anymore. I was wearing this dress to preside over its demolition. I opened my jewelry box. I took out the pearls Lucas's father had given me for our 25th anniversary. They weren't the oversized, gaudy baubles Victoria Sterling wore. They were small, lustrous, and real. I fastened the clasp around my neck. The click was a small, metallic punctuation mark. Armor, asterisk, I thought. I stepped into the heels, navy pumps, sensible but elegant. I stood up to my full height. Worthiness, I whispered to the mirror. For weeks, that word had been a weapon used against me, not worthy of the aesthetic, not worthy of the ceremony. I had let them define it. I had let them tell me that worth was calculated in liquid assets, in offshore accounts, in the cohesion of a color palette. But they were wrong. Worthiness wasn't an aesthetic, it was a vault. I was the vault. I was the keeper of the truth. I held the records. I held the receipts. I held the memory of who people actually were, not who they pretended to be. The Sterlings were paper-thin fictions, blowing in the wind of their own debt. I was the archive, heavy, grounded, and impossible to move. I turned away from the mirror. I didn't need to check my reflection again. I knew who I was. I walked back downstairs, the heels creating a new rhythm on the steps. Asterisk, clack, 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 asterisk, a sound of authority. The house was waiting for me. The dining room was a stage set for a tragedy. The 4 teacups sat in their saucers, gleaming in the afternoon light. The folders, Tobias's deadly collection of facts, were stacked neatly in the center of the table, squared away with the edges of the placemats. I walked to the kitchen and checked the kettle. It was just starting to boil, a low rumble that vibrated through the handle. I poured the water into the teapot, watching the steam rise and curl into the air. The scent of Earl Grey filled the room, bergamot and black tea, sharp and clean. I carried the tray into the dining room and set it down. Then I waited. I stood by the window, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I looked at the grandfather clock in the hall. The pendulum swung back and forth, a relentless, impartial judge of time. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was 1:58 p.m. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't trembling. I felt a strange, icy clarity like the air in the high mountains. I looked at the driveway. The gray concrete was empty, a blank canvas waiting for the final brushstroke. I thought of Lucas. I thought of the boy who had scraped his knee and trusted me to fix it. I realized with a pang of finality that I was about to hurt him in order to save him. I was about to burn down the house of cards he was living in. He would hate me for it. He might never speak to me again. But a librarian doesn't destroy books just because the ending is sad. We preserve them because they are true. Tick-tock. The minute hand clicked onto the 12. 2:00 p.m. And then, right on cue, I heard it. The crunch of heavy tires on gravel. The low, purring idle of a luxury engine. A black SUV, sleek and predatory, pulled into the driveway and came to a stop. The engine cut. The silence returned for a split second, heavier than before. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of old wood and tea. I smoothed the navy silk one last time. "Library is open," I whispered. I walked to the front door. The black SUV door opened with a heavy, expensive thunk. I watched through the peephole, distorted by the glass, as Victoria and Charles Sterling stepped onto my walkway. They were a vision of manufactured success. Victoria was wearing a cream-colored cashmere coat that dragged slightly on the wet pavement, a garment chosen by a woman who had forgotten, or simply didn't care, that she lived in a city famous for mud. Charles wore a suit that was tailored within an inch of its life, his silver hair coiffed into a helmet of executive authority. They looked like a magazine cover. They looked like the parents of a dynasty. But from where I stood, safe behind my oak door, I didn't smell success. I smelled desperation. It radiated off them like heat off the pavement. It was in the tightness of Charles's jaw, the frantic brightness of Victoria's smile as she adjusted her collar. They walked with the hurried, brittle energy of people who were running out of runway. They reached for the doorbell. I opened the door before their fingers could touch the brass. The sudden movement made Charles flinch. Victoria's hand froze in midair, her smile faltering for a microsecond before she plastered it back on, wider and tighter than before. "Eleanor," she exclaimed, her voice pitching up into that breathless, girlish register. "My goodness, you're psychic. We were just about to ring." "I've been watching you, Victoria," I said. My voice was low, devoid of the flustered hospitality they were expecting. "Please, come in." I stepped back, allowing them to cross the threshold. As they passed me, a cloud of heavy floral perfume washed over the scent of my Earl Grey tea. It was cloying, designed to mask everything underneath it. "Oh, look at this," Charles said, his eyes immediately darting to the crown molding, then to the floorboards. He wasn't admiring the craftsmanship. He was appraising the collateral. I saw him mentally calculating the square footage, the resale value, the equity. "It's so charmingly vintage, Eleanor. A lot of timber in these old places, valuable timber." "It has good bones," I said, closing the front door and locking it. The click asterisk of the deadbolt echoed in the hallway. "And it's fully paid for." Charles turned to me, his smile not reaching his cold, assessing eyes. "That's a wonderful position to be in, Eleanor, but equity sitting in wood is just sleeping money. We want to help you wake it up." "I'm sure you do," I said. "This way, we're in the dining room." I led them down the hall, my heels clicking on the hardwood. I could feel them exchanging glances behind my back, looks of pity, looks of greed. They saw the navy silk dress and the pearls, and I knew exactly what they were thinking. The old widow played dress-up. How quaint. This will be easier than we thought. They were predators walking into a cage, convinced they were entering a petting zoo. We entered the dining room. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains, illuminating the table I had set. The 4 teacups, the silver spoons, and in the center the stack of manila folders, thick and menacing. "Please," I said, gesturing to the chairs on the side of the table. "Sit." Victoria unbuttoned her coat but didn't take it off, as if staying ready to flee. She sat down, smoothing her skirt. Charles took the seat next to her, placing a sleek leather portfolio on the table. "Eleanor, dear," Victoria started, leaning forward with faux intimacy. "We know things got a little emotional yesterday. Lucas is just so stressed. We want you to know that we don't blame you for being confused by the invoice. Modern weddings are so complex." "Incredibly complex," Charles added, opening his portfolio to reveal a glossy brochure about wealth management. "That's why we brought this. We have a structure in mind, a reverse leverage strategy that would free up cash from this property immediately. It would cover the wedding, giving Lucas the start he deserves, and leave you with a monthly stipend. We can handle all the paperwork today." He uncapped a gold fountain pen and laid it on the table, pointing it at me like a dagger. I didn't look at the pen. I looked at Charles. I sat down at the head of the table, the position of power. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. "You speak a lot about value, Charles," I said softly. "It's my business, Eleanor." "And you, Victoria," I said, turning my gaze to her. "You speak a lot about aesthetics, about what fits, about who belongs." Victoria laughed, a nervous tinkle of sound. "Well, standards are important, aren't they?" "They are," I agreed. "Accuracy is also important. In the library, if a book is mislabeled, we call it an error, but if a book is empty, we call it a fraud." The smile slipped from Victoria's face. Charles stiffened. "I'm not sure I follow your metaphor, Eleanor," Charles said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. "We are here to help you. We have a meeting in Bellevue at 4, so let's not waste time with riddles." "We aren't going to Bellevue," I said. I reached out and placed my hand on the stack of folders. "And we aren't talking about my house. My house is fine. My taxes are paid. My title is clear." I flipped open the first folder. It wasn't the invoice. It was the foreclosure notice for *442 Evergreen Point Road ***. I slid it across the polished wood until it hit Charles's portfolio. Charles looked down. I saw the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin the color of old ash. "I know about the foreclosure, Charles," I said, my voice steady and merciless. Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her throat. That is a mistake, a clerical error." "Is it?" I flipped the next page. The tax lien from the IRS, $482,000. I slid it across. "Is the IRS making clerical errors too?" "Now see here." Charles started to stand up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Sit down," I commanded. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was the voice that could silence a reading room of 300 people. Charles sat. I flipped the next page. The lawsuit from the catering company in Oregon. The lawsuit from the construction firm. The bankruptcy freeze from the Cayman Islands. I dealt them out like tarot cards, one by one, covering his glossy brochure with the undeniable, paper-trailed wreckage of their lives. "You aren't wealthy," I said, looking Victoria in the eye. "You are broke. You are insolvent. You are squatting in a corporate rental, and you are using my son as a credit card to pay for a lifestyle that expired 5 years ago." The room was silent. The ticking of the clock seemed to get louder. Tick, tock. The mask of the sterling aesthetic had cracked. Victoria wasn't the imperious matriarch anymore. She was a terrified woman in a dirty coat. Charles wasn't a tycoon. He was a tired conman caught in the headlights. "Who," Charles croaked, his voice dry, "who gave you these?" I'm a librarian, Charles, I said, leaning back in my chair, smoothing the silk of my navy dress. I don't need to be given information. I know how to find it. I looked at the study door. It was time. And I didn't just audit you, I said, a small, cold smile touching my lips. I brought a witness. The study door opened. Tobias Finch stepped out, his tweed jacket rumpled, his eyes sharp behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He walked into the dining room and stood behind my chair, crossing his arms. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Charles with the expression of a man who had seen 1,000 balance sheets and knew exactly where the bodies were buried. Charles looked at Tobias, then back at me. He realized the trap hadn't just sprung, it had crushed him. I rested my hands on the table, feeling the cool pearl of my necklace against my skin. I wasn't the victim. I wasn't the mother of the groom who could be hidden behind a fern. I was the matriarch. You came here to assess my worth, I said, my voice ringing with finality. You came to see if I was valuable enough to be harvested. I tapped the pile of evidence with my index finger. But it appears you made a miscalculation. So, Charles, Victoria. I leaned forward. We're going to have a conversation about worthiness.